This is another episode of Design Your Dream Home with Doug and Steve. And now the architects, Doug Patt and Stephen Chung.
You are watching or listening to the Design Your Dream Home with Doug and Steve. I am Steve. I got that right for the first time. That is Doug. Good morning, Doug.
Hello.
Hey, so I know it's about time to go on vacation just before July 4th, and I wanted to just mention to you where I'm going and sort of the idea. I thought you might find it kind of interesting.
Give it to me.
So instead of the hotel kind of thing, because we go up to way up in the woods and it's really, there's nothing there except beautiful landscape, we are been doing this Airbnb thing. And so what I've been doing is actually looking for architect design houses. And because my idea of going out in the woods is actually staying in a nice cabin, nicely designed cabin in the woods, not a rustic cabin. So Toshiko Mori is a very good architect, and she designed a house in Maine on a rocky cliff, glass house, sort of facing the water. So we'll hang out there for a week. So that's my architect kind of inspired vacation travel. So.
Dude, that's amazing. I mean, leave it to an architect to end up staying in a really awesome house and planning it all out. And wow, I'm jealous. Sounds really cool. Take some pictures.
I will take pictures with my drone.
Right on. Yeah, that's cool. So cool. We'll post them on our site.
Okay, awesome. So today is I think a little different in terms of a topic. I thought it might be interesting because I think it's something that you encounter whether you're designing a dream home or anything else when you're designing something. And it has to do with creativity. How do I ask that question? How can we be more creative? Something like that?
Yeah.
How do we spur creativity? I mean, we're asked about it all the time because that's what we do, right? We've got to come up with ideas, and where do ideas come from? So let's see if we can come up with 3 tips each on the subject of creativity. You want to kick it off?
Yeah, man, this is right up my alley. I mean, I teach about this at the Architects Academy online, and I've thought about this a lot over the years. I really believe, I believe on one hand, people are born creative. You know, there are naturally some people that are simply more creative than others. However, I do believe that people can learn to be more creative, particularly if they ask the right questions. So I've spent over the last 10 or 15 years, both working as an architect and also designing products. And in both cases, you've got to be creative, but you've got to ask the right questions. So my tips today have to do with how to become or be more creative by asking the right questions. And so the first thing that I would say is that you've got to ask yourself the first question: who are you designing for? And this really has to do with a product or a building, right? So the first question is, who are you designing for? So as an architect and as a residential architect, I will typically have somebody come to me and say, Doug, we want you to design our home. And it could be anybody. But when I look at them, I think about the fact that the who is really the client and their program. That answers that question. So when I first meet somebody, you get an impression right away as to whether or not they've got a ton of money to spend, right? Or they've got very little money to spend, or just enough money to spend. So that's something that has to do with that who question. They're also going to talk a lot about whether or not they want to design a really big house, or they want to design a small house, or they want to do a renovation addition project. So that also, I believe, is kind of part of answering that question of who they are. It's the client and the program. People are typically, you can kind of tell right away, are they humble? Are they audacious, right? Are they going to design something that's going to be understated, or it's going to be completely blown out of the water, right? Are they creative people, or are they kind of straight-laced? That's going to say, or the building, I should say, is going to say a lot about them, right? And that whole process of working with them. Are they super creative? Do they want you to throw everything into this? Or are they designing a kind of a traditional home and it's not going to be super creative unless you're looking at, the kind of planning that you're doing, right? So it's not going to be a super contemporary or modern home. And the last thing is really their program, right? So how many cars do they have? How many bedrooms do they want? Do they want a library, an office? Are they going to ask for 2 dishwashers in the kitchen or 1? Do they want a full basement? Are they going to want a wine cellar, tennis courts, pools, and you name it? So the first question I would say, if you're going to be designing a house, it's going to be for you or it's going to be somebody close to you. You've got to ask that question, who? And in answering that, it's going to start to help you to become, I think, more creative, because you're going to be responding to all the answers to that question. So that's my first tip.
Okay, good tip. So let's pretend now for a second I'm the homeowner. So let me take it from that perspective. I would say something about collecting ideas, collecting images. And I think that, in the past, people used to do this by having clipping things from magazines and putting them into a folder. And of course, now with Pinterest or Houzz, there are things like idea books or folders that they've created for you, or you just can drag them onto your own computer. But really collect images, collect inspiration images without necessarily trying to design anything. It's more like really over a period of time, seeing kind of what things are consistent or clear or common themes that you may not even know, but somehow just through the act of collecting, you'd be amazed if you share that with an architect. When I look at what people have collected, they share these folders with me. I can kind of really pretty quickly sort of kind of boil it down to, this person really likes this kind of space, this kind of space, or what have you, or these materials, or these kind of relationships. It's sometimes it's not easy to see or feel or to articulate, especially if you're not an architect or a designer. But just the act of collecting is a kind of form of creativity. You don't think of it that way. You think, oh, I'm just a pick collector. No, you're actually editing just by the mere fact of selecting one of the projects you see in this magazine. That project is saying something, and you're collecting ideas. That, for me, is already a first step of being creative. It's really, I guess, setting the table for the next step. Now, for me, like you talked about, now as an architect, you talked about getting a program brief. Now, architects, not for a house as much, but for bigger projects, we would get these big manuals, these big, thick manuals that said, this is what we want. We want, this many bedrooms with this much space. And they're incredibly detailed and defined when it has to do with a bigger building like a hotel. And it's, besides, okay, there's the code book, there's all these local regulations. You have to read all these books and all these manuals, and you feel like, how am I going to come up with anything out of all this information, all this mess? And my favorite architect, Alvaro Aalto, used to say that he would read all of that stuff that would be given to him by his staff. He would read all of it, pour through it for a couple of days, and put it away. And not start drawing right away, just absorbing, digesting all the information. And after a while, you'd be like, hey, you gonna start working on this project? And you're like, yeah, I'm working on it. It's sort of, things are churning inside. And only after, however long it took, only after he began to sort of pick up a sketchbook and just start scribbling, there was something there in that translation or that time, that interpretation of reading and digesting that material. So that when those first sketches were coming out, he had already digested a lot of that material. And I think for me, it's like that as well. So it's really getting all those images from, let's say, a client, the images I talked about, collecting them, looking at them, and not really starting, just kind of digesting it all. So that's for me. That's my first step of how I'm creative, and also for a homeowner, how I think that they can be creative.
I think it's great.
Number 2.
So my second tip for being creative or being more creative would be that you've got to ask yourself, what are you designing? Now, a little bit of this is mentioned in the who, but the what is really, what kind of building are you designing? So an architect clearly designs residential buildings, commercial, industrial, which could be like manufacturing, and then institutional, which is a gigantic category. It's like educational, medical, military, religious, all of that stuff. As a residential architect, when somebody's coming to me and talking about designing a home, there's really 2 different kinds of homes. There's a house and there's a home. So a house, when I think about house, it's a building that people are going to be living in, but only briefly, right? So they're going to design it, and it's maybe a summer house. It's something that does not take up all of their time or is not taken up by all of their time. And then there's a home or a dwelling. It's something that these people are going to be living in a kind of long term. So there are definitely two different kinds of buildings, even within that category. But more so, what I'm thinking about is the style of architecture, right? What are they looking for? So when a client comes to us, they'll say, we want a contemporary building or we want a traditional building. But within that category, there are tons of ways to break that down, right? So a contemporary building could be a modern building. It could be international style. It could be mid-century modern. It could be transitional. It could be deconstructivist. I mean, we don't get a lot of projects like that, but we do get a lot of contemporary houses. And within all those styles, there are lots of ways to design. So I think back to your point about this house thing, I think that has really changed the way we make architecture. I mean, all you got to do is go online onto Pinterest or Houzz and take a look at details, or just Google a kind of detail. And within seconds, you can see all these wonderful instances of it. So when clients take photographs or they take screenshots of those things and they send them off to me, immediately you know where they're headed. I also think it has it helps architects be more creative. I mean, the reality is architects are always kind of ripping each other off or learning from one another at the very least. Yeah. And so seeing all of these things and being able to see all this great work online, I think is really advantageous for both the client and the architect. So I would say, when you ask the question, what are you designing? And you simply say, well, I'm going to design a traditional house. There are lots of different kinds of traditional homes. And we talked about this last week. How does the home fit into the neighborhood? And does it fit in at all? And should it? And does it need to? So what are you designing? Yeah, you got to really think about not only the fact it's a residential building, but whether or not it's contemporary or traditional, and then break it down into what kind of style, and then start to pull some images and think about, what you want that building to look like. So that's my second tip.
No, that's great. And actually, I wanted to follow up on that because I really like your point about, not that architects are necessarily ripping each other off, but I like the learning from each other.
Right, you say it better than I did.
No, you said it that. You actually said learning from. I had a student one time who I knew liked this famous architect named Rem Koolhaas. And when I would sort of ask him, why don't you go look at this project by that architect or learn from that architect? And he said, I want to be really original. I don't want to look at other things.
Yeah.
And I said, well, I know you like Rem Koolhaas. He goes, yeah, I like him. He's so original. I said, I promise you, because he's my teacher, he knows everything that's ever been done. He learns and absorbs from everybody. Yeah. What? If you want to be like him, you need to know everything, not know everything, and you think you're going to be original. And so, yes, you see lots of students that sort of come up with that attitude, and they how about this? You say, yeah, that's okay. That looks sort of like that guy. It's like, what do you mean? I came up with it on my own. I know, but the path that you're traveling has been traveled thousands of times. And why not learn from it? Why not? Don't worry about being original. Just make the project your project, and you can learn from others. That's the way we all learn. So I think that's a great tip. I just want to also mention, you had also thrown out a couple terms, and I love trying to sort of be more precise about terms because I think it confuses people. So if you said home and house, and actually put in dwelling. So let's just say home and house. You said that house you use when it's sort of less, I don't know,
less
not your everyday place, less personalized. Okay.
Yeah.
And home is like your cozy home. It's your
home is a dwelling. Yeah, I mean, I think about.
When you said dwelling again, what do you mean dwelling? Yeah, I didn't know the term. So what does dwelling mean? Home and dwelling are together?
Right. I mean, dwelling, the word dwelling is to indwell, right? To live in something, to occupy that space in a very personal way over a long period of time. That's the way I think about it.
So that's why we call this podcast Design Your Dream Home, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, I've distracted myself from my second. No, you know what it has to do with? And so there is my last example I explained about getting all the information and somehow your first sketches and your scribbling and your ideas are starting to pour out of your pen or your pencil. Like, where does that happen? For me, when I was working in a big office, you didn't really have a chat. You would sit at your desk and sort of say, okay, it's time. It's 9 o'clock. Start designing. And I could not work like that. I found that impossible to, on demand, produce something. And it was even harder if you had a principal over my shoulder, like, okay, what are we doing?
Oh my gosh.
How am I?
Nightmare.
Let me think. Let me think. And One of my favorite architects is a Portuguese architect named Álvaro Siza, who you know very well. And he's a principal. He's a world famous guy. Everyone comes to him. We need a new museum. We need a spectacular this. We need this. And I can't imagine the pressure you'd feel by, first by being very talented and famous. And then now more and more people are looking at whatever you do and criticizing it. And, oh, that museum didn't quite make it this time, or he's lost it, or just that pressure of being watched. And for him, he leaves the office. He goes, sits in a busy cafe where he can be anonymous. He brings a sketchbook with him, has a coffee or espresso, and he just hangs out there all afternoon. And it's not like he's recognized. He likes the anonymity. He likes the noise, the little, chatter, and just that. It puts him in he said, a mood, a kind of a relaxation, a place of relaxation and comfort where his mind is freed, and then the ideas start flowing out of his mind. And I love that example because it really has there can be pressure. I mean, pressure to create is not the right environment. If you feel like I've got a roadblock, stop. Come back. Hit it another way. And for him, it was about finding that cafe atmosphere. For me, it might be just watching like a baseball game, something kind of boring and slow, and just kind of sitting there. And let me grab my book here, my sketchbook, right? And just let me, I feel no pressure. I feel slightly distracted actually, which I like. Yeah. And somehow that pressure gone really helps. So that's my tip on being creative. Take that pressure.
That's awesome, man. I love that. And I like I like the info on Álvaro Siza. When I worked in Portugal, I worked for Fernando Tavera, who was Siza's teacher. I actually worked for Bernardo Tavera, who was Fernando's son. Anyway, that was many years ago. So I never got to meet Álvaro Siza, but I had been in his office a couple times, and I got to meet some really neat architects down there. They do things totally different. When we made models, we made them out of balsa wood. You know how difficult that is, right? We use basswood here in the States. Yep. And balsa, just really tough to cut. And it was the only thing that they could really get at the time. This was decades ago, unfortunately. Okay. So let's see here. You got a book. You got Siza there.
No, Tavera.
You got Tavera?
But of course I can't find it, but I promise you I have
That's so cool. Actually, a model I made got published in a Portuguese magazine. I'll show it to you sometime. Pretty cool.
All right,
I was the model guy.
Sorry, me looking at my books doesn't help. Okay, go to your third tip.
So let's see here. So my third tip, super simple. I'll actually tell a story first. So I had a friend, I think I talked about this in another podcast, but I had a friend called me up, said, hey, we want to design a house. Let's meet for lunch. We'll talk about it. I'm so excited. Let's get rolling. So we sat down at lunch. We're talking. And when we got to the point where I said, where's the site? He said, well, we don't have one yet. We're going to design a house first. And I said, you know what, man? Yeah, I love you. And this is going to be awesome. And I can't wait to design it, but I'm not going to design a house for you until we have the site. So my third tip is, where are you designing, this building? And again, this has to do with just about anything. So if you're designing a product, it has a site too, right? I mean, whether it's in your hands or it's sitting out in your backyard or you're sitting in it, it has a site. Everything has a site. So buildings have a site. So when you think about a piece of architecture, one of the things you want to think about is, where's the sun, and what is the sun's relationship to the building, and where's the sun coming in, where's it rising, where is it setting, right? How does that affect the architecture? Where are the views? I mean, could you imagine designing a house for somebody and putting on a piece of property and not thinking about where the views are? I mean, I spend half my time looking out the windows at my house, right? Mm-hmm. That's so important. So you got to think about where the views are. What's the climate? So Northeast, water, huge issue, right? I mean, you and I have spent 20 years learning about what water does to buildings. So you got to think about the water, the rain, the snow, the ice. Where's the sun? Where's the wind? What's the temperature? So Northeast, we're always thinking about super hot, super cold. What's it doing to the architecture? Out West, they don't think as much about the water, and they're not thinking about the cold weather. They're thinking more about, it's super hot, and how are we going to deal with that with the roofs and all the exterior materials, et cetera. And what's the topography? So do a lot of work up in Greenwich. There's tons of rock, bedrock everywhere, right? Especially along the coast. So we get out there, they start digging, and all of a sudden we're finding these massive pieces of bedrock It turns out you can pin a building to bedrock. So that's super awesome. The challenge is when it's half bedrock and you want a basement, right? And then you got to blast and you got chipping, and gets super expensive. And then there's the topography, the actual topography. So how curvilinear is the site and how dramatic is the site? Is it super flat? Does it have a cliff on it? Is there a giant hill on it? How does the building integrate to that? So if you want a really cool building, thinking about topography and water, look at falling water. Look at Frank Lloyd Wright's architecture and how did he incorporate that piece of architecture into the topography and into the water as it flows through the site. And then lastly, I'd say zoning and building codes. Everywhere we go, today we deal with the IRC, International Residential Code, mostly in most states, but every one of these states and local municipalities has its own rules as well. Mm-hmm. So not only do you got to know the national rules, you got to know the local rules. And that can keep an architect busy full-time regardless, right? I mean, many of these big offices have people in their office just doing that, right? Dealing with all the rules. When you got a question, you go to that guy. So anyway, where are you designing? What is the site for your piece of architecture? And I guarantee you, if you answer all the questions that I just called out there, you're going to be more creative because you're all of a sudden you're solving problems. Right. So there you have it.
No, that's a great point. And for example, even with building codes, sometimes you see a code, you reread it, and you think, And it sometimes spurs on a little creative moment where you can figure out how to do something in a slightly different way. And for developers, especially with zoning, how you interpret zoning, and if you're able to find a clever way around certain zoning to create more buildable area, I mean, that's where I think often where you don't necessarily see the creativity, but somehow there's been a very creative force behind that concept to bring something that you wouldn't normally see just because you've interpreted something differently. So I love having those obstacles, if you want to call them, or parameters, really, and those often spur creativity.
Awesome.
Okay, my last one has to do with, again, more abstract, maybe not even about architecture. It could be really for anything, but I was actually backstage at this conference, and there was the main speaker that gave his presentation, Tony Hsieh, founder of Zappos.com, the shoe company, and he gave a really great talk, and he talked about innovation because he's known as such an innovative company. And people said, "Oh, where do you get your ideas from? And you must get them from Silicon Valley and all the other high-tech guys." And he says, "No, he never looks to tech world for ideas. He looks for places that you would find inspiration that you would never think. He always goes outside his industry for inspiration." So he talked to us architects, and he basically said he imagines that if we were looking for inspiration, well, why aren't we looking at, I don't know, food? I'm like, what? How can that be? And so years later, when I was pitching my own TV show at PBS and talking to different people, I had a hard time explaining kind of concepts and what it would be about. And we talked about this building. We'll make this building. It'll be this great new museum. And people would kind of look at me like, we don't get it. And it was only after I started learning about the Food Network and food, right? So by coincidence, and looked at some of the shows, and I realized the shows are really centered around people, not around food. You were there because you want to learn how to make the food, but you really liked that chef or that personality, Rachel Ray, whoever it was. And so from that example, I went back to PBS and said, you know what? It's going to be people. It's going to be about people. It's going to be about an owner, a client, an architect, and an end user, and me to help sort of facilitate that conversation. But it's always going to be those three people. And they said, we got it. We like it. We understand it.
That's awesome.
And so I found that example helped me, and just by looking at something in a different way. So now I'm working on something, and I don't have a lot of space on this house, and I've got to find a way to make a couple of bedrooms. And I looked online for small bedrooms and this, and I couldn't find anything that really kind of inspired me. And so what did I do? I looked at micro hotels in Japan, because those guys are thinking about it all the time, right? I mean, they're thinking about, we don't have a lot of space. This is what they do every day. And I got an avalanche of different concepts, which then I took and have been sort of translating and trying out on this house. So a house in Florida, looking at a Japanese hotel to get inspiration. And it's not like it's a literal translation, but more just that, wow, someone's already been looking at that and thinking about that, but just not a house. Maybe it's a hotel or something else. And for me, whenever there's something that's just not clicking, I don't necessarily kind of bury myself in that same place. I have to go look outside. It might be in architecture, it might be something else completely different. But I find trying to hit a problem from different angles all the time is always the best way. And when I hit it, it doesn't take that long. When I hit it 2 or 3 times and it's not going through, I say, you know what, I'm going to pull back. I'm going to look at it another way. I'm going to go another way. So that's my example, or my third tip. Try to look at, if you're having a problem with a problem, try another route. Go another way.
Yeah, I think that's awesome. That makes me think about when I'm writing scripts for videos. Many times what I'll do is I'll sit down and I'll write for 2 or 3 hours, and I won't even look at it again for another day or two. Then I'll go back to it. I'll read through it again, make changes, and then let it sit for another day or two, and then I'll go back to it again. And many times what I find is, and this goes for emails too, right? You write an email to somebody, maybe it's a terse email because you're upset, or you always got to give these things time. And the more time you give them, I find the more creative they are and the better they are, the more ironed out they are. So I know that's slightly related, but I think as you get older, you learn how to deal with all of these things in the kind of best ways, and to be patient is really important. And I think part of what you're talking about is being patient, right? Saying, you know what? I'm not going to try to solve it by looking at the same thing. Yeah. I'm going to make my brain work for me here. I'm going to look at something completely different and work and allow myself to work through it. And that's great advice. I love it.
Sometimes you think that you should be working when it seems that you're not. But I think actually, for me, it's sort of when something is a dilemma, it's in my mind. It's in my mind, and I sometimes need to go away. And it's actually something is churning inside, but again, we take the pressure off, and somehow, as you say, being patient, not being stressed about it and worrying about it, just put that aside. Going to do something else, and you'd be surprised how things sort of emerge when you take the pressure off and you let your mind do whatever it's in your workings it needs to do to sort of take that problem and shake it around different ways. So,
absolutely,
okay, awesome tip.
Agreed.
All right, Doug, so now we come to the time where we answer a viewer or watcher, question. Hi, Doug and Steve. I've been collecting images for a future dream project for years now, and now we're getting close to moving forward. And it seems they might need an architect, Doug, so we should help her. Okay. But now I'm finding myself overwhelmed by all the cool things that I've collected. I don't know how I could possibly make the right choices. Now I find myself wanting to delay my plans. Help!
Oh my gosh. Boy, I've said to people, you go to a dinner party and people say, hey, Doug, since you're an architect, will you design your own home someday? Or do you live in the home you designed? And I say, there is no way I could ever do that, because I could never settle on one idea. I think it would just be endless for me, and I'd be constantly second guessing myself. So I don't think I could ever settle in on that. Now, I know you are completely different because you live in the home you designed. So I relate to this listener viewer. Oh my gosh. I don't even really know what to say, because you can, this is what I would say. If you've got the wherewithal, that is, if you've got the money to design anything that you really, what your heart's desire is, that's not that hard to figure out. You could probably narrow it down to 2 or 3 exterior elevation images of a style and a diagrammatic, object-like form, something that you're thinking about in your mind. And you could probably narrow it down, the plan down, to something relatively simple. What you really want. So I think you've got to wade through all the stuff and get rid of the garbage and decide what you really want. Just as an aside, I got an email today from a young guy who is studying music, and he's been doing it for 2 years. He's at an academy. He's finding it monotonous, although he loves music, and he plays 2 instruments, and it sounds like he's already been relatively successful, and he's thinking about becoming an architect. And so he kind of laid out his career path thus far, talked about all the things he's good at and not good at. He took my Could You Be an Architect quiz, and he wants to know if I think he could be an architect, if he will enjoy being an architect. And I've got to tell you, I mean, people ask me this all the time, and it is next to impossible to answer that question for people. But what I do tell them is, deep down in your heart, you know what you like to do. So I said to him, you know, you could either choose to be an architect who does music on the side as a hobby, or you could be a musician who does architecture or enjoys architecture on the side as a hobby. I think everybody has the ability to cull things down. So very long answer. I think you got to sit down with what you got and cull it down. You got to figure out what you really love and go after it. I don't know if I'd ever be able to do that, but I think our listener might be able to do. What do you think?
Well, I mean, this is what we're there for, right? Because if it's not my house, well, first, okay, we'll talk about my house later. But if it's for somebody else and they bring me these images, that's what we talked about before. I will distill what I see there. I will see, as you again mentioned, the site that they have, the budget that they have, the regulations, all of those things. I will look at all these images and I will begin to distill what I see on this side, bring them into the picture over here, and then we'll start cycling through different options, variations, different approaches. None of them necessarily the definitive one, but more like, you know, I see 400 things here, but really what I see is actually 4 themes. I'm going to try to bring those 4 themes and try to match them and marry them with this site and your budget and all of these other parameters, and we'll sort of cycle through that. So I think most architects are able to kind of take all of that information and again distill it and really try to sort of find, I don't know if you want to call it a theme or maybe essential concepts. But you know, again, if this person likes 70 materials, but I say, you know, the 4 that I keep seeing here, those 4 work really together, very well together. I think 4 or 5 materials in one place, that's enough. If you've got 62, it's going to look like Frankenstein. I mean, unless you like Frankenstein, and that's fine. But you know, typically I try not to make Frankenstein-looking buildings. Really, that's why when we're looking at all this inspiration images, it's just there's certain moments, there's certain aspects of each. It's not all of it. But you've got to sort of distill those things, bring them into the picture, and then sort of make them your own or make them for them. So I think that's always a process that we go through. In terms of my own house, so yes, it's easy to be overwhelmed because I do the same thing. I've got stacks and stacks of books of architects that I love and things that I want to try and I could do, and of course I had no budget. But I'm very impetuous too. I kind of just tend to go for it when it's time. We're going to go for it. And on this house, I drew pretty much, let's say, 85% of what I thought it was going to be. And then during construction, the last 15, 20%, I did it in the field. I sort of looked at it and I said, okay, I know I got about a week here to decide, but I think I'm going to move the wall that way. I'm going to do a little of this. And we just did it. We did it in the field. And it's a little stressful, but it's very exciting too. You feel kind of very energized because this is what we do. And as you know, I mean, there's a lot of pressure because that's what we do, right? This is my home. I designed this house, so people come over, they're like, "Oh my God, that guy's an architect." It's kind of like, I guess if you're like a hairstylist and your hair is like this, maybe it's like, oh. So you know, it's important. It's important to as a reflection of what I do and what I'm about. So, but if I think about it too much, it's overwhelming. It's overwhelming. So I think it's more like getting immersed in the task and not worrying about all that, and just really focusing on my minuscule budget and what I need, which is a great study and a well lit bedroom and a small kitchen and whatever it is that we needed at the time for our family. Those are the things that sort of preoccupied me and. It's truly trying to, again, relax and take all of that distraction, all that pressure away. And as again, I'm impulsive. So I think when it would sort of crystallize, I said, that's it, we're going for it. So again, different personality, but I think sometimes it just sort of takes that. It takes that. And believe me, I made mistakes. I think that a lot of things I did were not right. I'd do them better if I thought about them more, I had more patience, but maybe it would have never got done either. So I think you know yourself, I guess, and you have to kind of figure out the best way that it works for you. And I think in terms of a homeowner working with an architect that kind of understand you and kind of go back and forth, be a good sounding board. It's not always like the information has to come from me and Doug. Sometimes it comes from you and we help you to find it. Sometimes it's your idea and we'll just help you to make it. Other times it's, hey, why don't we bounce some things off of you? So I think that process, this whole creative process, engaging an architect is really about bringing someone else into the picture to help you make your project. It's collaborative. It's any creative effort to me is really more than one person, especially with a house or something like that. So I guess those are my final thoughts on being creative.
Right on. Sounds great, man. Spoken like a true architecture professor.
Former.
Right.
All right, Doug, you want to close it out?
Yeah, you've been watching Design Your Dream Home with Doug and Steve. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.